Welcome to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Drop your city, your state, or your country down below in the comments right now, because I want to know how far this story travels. Every single voice matters in this room. Please note that while this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling and educational purposes, the core lesson hidden beneath the surface is one worth keeping close to your heart. The sharp, metallic sound of my worn leather suitcase crashing against polished marble steps echoes in my mind every single day. Before I could even catch my breath, my daughter-in-law Jessica's razor-thin voice pierced the humid Florida air. This community is strictly reserved for high society elites, Thomas, not a broken-down, filthy plumber looking for a place to rot away. My name is Thomas Miller. I spent 40 long years working as a master plumber, crawling through flooded, freezing basements in the bitter winter winds of Springfield, Massachusetts. I never once complained about a single aching knee or a single frozen wrench stuck to my raw palms. Every callus on these hands went toward one singular sacred purpose: putting food on my only son's table and keeping a secure roof over his head. I started in the plumbing trade at 19, straight out of high school, armed with nothing more than a second-hand steel toolbox left behind by my own father and an unyielding willingness to crawl into tight, dark crawl spaces that most men wouldn't dare touch. My sweet wife, Margaret, used to tell me with a gentle, loving smile that I was the most stubborn man she had ever known. But Margaret passed away when our son, David, was only 8 years old, stolen away by an aggressive pancreatic cancer that didn't even give us time to say a proper goodbye. One season she was packing David's school lunchbox and humming off-key to the kitchen radio, and the next season she was gone. I sat by her hospital bedside through her final agonizing night, holding her fragile hand until it grew completely cold. Then I drove home, made David breakfast, walked him to school, and showed up at my first plumbing job of the day because I had 2 apprentice workers depending on their weekly paychecks and a heavy mortgage that cared nothing about my grief. I never remarried. David was my entire reason to keep breathing, and keeping my head down and working hard was the only way I knew how to survive. When he earned a partial scholarship to Ohio State, I sat alone in my work truck and cried tears of pure relief before driving home to congratulate him. And when he graduated and landed a corporate position, I helped him pack his sedan, patted his shoulder, and told him to call his old man every single Sunday without fail. He called for a few months, but then he met Jessica Calloway at a high-end corporate mixer in Naples, Florida, and the Sunday calls slowly grew shorter, then less frequent, until they stopped being phone calls entirely and devolved into brief, cold text messages. I constantly lied to myself, whispering that it was normal, that this is simply what happens when your son builds his own prosperous life. 5 years ago, David called me with a strained, desperate tone in his voice, explaining that he and Jessica wanted to buy a permanent home in an exclusive gated community in Naples, Florida, citing the immaculate neighborhood for future grandchildren. He never asked me for a single dime directly, but I heard the heavy hesitation in his throat when he danced around the topic of the massive down payment, and my heart broke because I instantly knew what it meant. I liquidated every single asset I had built over a lifetime of labor. I wiped out my modest personal savings account, cashed out my retirement fund, and took out a high-risk personal loan against the equity of my humble Springfield house. When all the numbers were crunched, I had enough cash to purchase the multi-million-dollar Florida property completely outright, and I did just that. I wisely kept the official grant deed in my own name because the legal liability of the loan rested entirely on my shoulders. But I allowed David to sign the resident lease, hugging him tightly at the closing table and whispering into his ear, "Don't you worry, son. You will always have a secure home no matter what storms life throws your way." He hugged me back and told me I was the greatest father in the world. I believed him, because when you love a child unconditionally, you desperately want to believe every word that flatters your sacrifices. By the time spring rolled around last year, severe arthritis in my knees made ignoring the pain impossible. One afternoon, while wrestling with a heavy pipe in a damp crawl space, I dropped my wrench and physically could not pull myself back up without assistance from my apprentice, Marcus. My doctor delivered the grim verdict. My joints were deteriorating far faster than expected, and if I kept working at that brutal pace, I would be confined to a wheelchair before turning 70. I filed for early retirement 2 weeks after that humiliating afternoon, trading my tools for a modest monthly pension while my life savings remained permanently locked into David's luxurious Florida home. As the New England autumn crept into Springfield, painting the maple trees in brilliant shades of red while wood smoke drifted from neighborhood chimneys, a crushing, suffocating loneliness settled deep into my chest. My wonderful neighbor, Mrs. Carol Reyes, used to leave hot containers of soup outside my door. One crisp afternoon, she caught me staring blankly down the street and asked the question that had been haunting my nights. You're finally going to pack up that old truck and drive out to see that boy in Florida, aren't you, Thomas? 3 days later, I loaded my battered suitcase into the truck bed, backed out of my driveway at 5 o'clock in the morning, and pointed my steering wheel south toward the sunshine. By the time I navigated my old truck onto the pristine, palm-lined streets of the exclusive gated community in Naples, on a warm Tuesday evening, the golden autumn sun was sinking low. I killed the engine, climbed out with my knees throbbing, walked up the immaculate stone walkway, and pressed the polished doorbell. A few moments later, the heavy oak door swung open, and my son looked at me not with warm affection, but with the cold, irritated expression of a man staring down an unexpected bill. "Dad," David muttered. Before I could open my arms, Jessica appeared behind him in a pristine silk blouse, her face freezing into a mask of pure disdain. "Thomas," she cooed in a voice dripping with synthetic politeness. "We certainly weren't expecting a vulgar, unannounced visitor today." She instructed David to throw me into the dark guest room at the far end of the service hallway. By the fourth day, any lingering illusions were brutally shattered. I walked out of the guest room to find my worn leather suitcase packed tight, zipped shut, and placed coldly in the public hallway alongside my toiletry bag, neatly lined up like abandoned luggage waiting outside a cheap motel checkout counter. Just as I stood there paralyzed, Jessica's sharp voice pierced through the master bedroom wall, followed closely by the calculating words of her wealthy real estate mogul father, Gerald Calloway, who had arrived earlier. "The sooner you throw that old, broken beggar out on the street, the better off our family name will be." The next morning, the formal execution took place in the living room. David stood silently with his back pressed flat against the wall, his arms tightly crossed, completely cowardly and entirely unable to meet my gaze. Jessica stepped forward, looking me up and down with absolute contempt, and snapped, "There is simply no room in this luxury house for an old man who does nothing all day but whine about his aching knees. You retired with absolutely nothing in your pockets. Have some basic self-awareness and find somewhere else to crawl off and die." Her mother, Diane, chimed in with a smile wrapped like a razor blade in silk. "A lifetime of crawling in muddy plumbing ditches with filthy, calloused hands. And you actually think that makes you the patriarch of this family? Look at yourself. You are a complete embarrassment to us all. Pick up that cheap suitcase right now and get out." I didn't argue. I turned around on legs that felt like hollow glass, walked down the hall, picked up my heavy suitcase, and carried it straight to the front door. Jessica eagerly pulled the heavy door open, shoved my bag across the marble threshold with her own foot, watched it tip sideways and tumble violently down the front steps, striking the concrete pavement with a loud, echoing crash that split the zipper and scattered my belongings across the pristine stone. Not stopping at that, Jessica whipped out her smartphone and dialed her wealthy parents on speakerphone, her voice carrying proudly across the quiet gated neighborhood. "Mom, Dad, drive over right now and see this. We are finally tossing this dirty, broke-down plumber right out of our elite community before he devalues our property values," she shrieked with venomous satisfaction, summoning them to bear witness to my complete humiliation. Through it all, David stood 10 feet away, staring down fixedly at his expensive Italian loafers, refusing to open his mouth to utter a single syllable of defense for his own father. I walked down those stairs in the gray morning light, my aging hands trembling so violently I could barely zip my bag back together, standing alone at the bottom of that pristine path with 60 years of hard-earned working-class dignity and absolutely nowhere left in the world to put it. Driven by a mixture of profound shock and raw survival instinct, I drove 2 hours north along Interstate 75 to Tampa, Florida, a rugged, working-class city where my modest monthly pension could stretch just enough to keep a roof over my head. The glossy, palm-fringed luxury of Naples dissolved into sun-faded stucco buildings and gritty asphalt streets, a landscape far more fitting for a man who had spent 40 years crawling through damp basements. I found shelter in a small, weathered apartment complex tucked away on the quiet outskirts of the city. Room 4B was barely 12 feet wide, containing a single lumpy bed covered by a faded blue quilt, a squeaking miniature refrigerator, and a small window looking out over a bustling corner intersection. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and it was a space where no one could look down on me for the calluses on my hands. Swallowing the bitter residue of my pride, I knew I had to keep busy to keep the dark, suffocating thoughts at bay. My immediate neighbor in room 4A was a wonderful, sturdy woman named Maria Reyes, a retired clinic nurse with deep laugh lines etched around her eyes, who made it her personal mission to ensure I didn't starve. 3 times a week, she would rap gently on my door, sliding heavy ceramic bowls of hot homemade chicken soup into my hands with a warm, maternal authority that anchored me back to reality. Through Maria's tight-knit neighborhood network, I was introduced to Ray Dominguez, a kind-hearted man in his mid-50s who owned the narrow, tightly packed little corner grocery store down the block. Ray's shop had a hand-painted sign above the register that read, "We don't have everything, but we have what you need." When Ray discovered I was a retired master plumber, his eyes lit up, and he immediately brought me to his back storage room to tackle a notoriously stubborn rattling pressure valve that 2 younger technicians had failed to fix. I had that line sealed, quieted, and running smoothly in under 30 minutes. Impressed by my swift, master-level craftsmanship, Ray began sliding my name and phone number to his regular customers across Tampa. Within a few short weeks, I had built a steady stream of small repair gigs, fixing slow drains, replacing worn washers, and securing sputtering gas fittings. Working with my tools again brought a familiar, comforting rhythm to my days, grounding me in the honest, tangible labor I had known my entire life. Then, roughly a month after my humiliating exile from Naples, an emergency dispatch order crossed Ray's desk from a regional property management firm that handled high-end, priority service calls across Southwest Florida. A wealthy client in an exclusive gated enclave had reported a severe, sudden water leak beneath a custom kitchen island, alongside a dangerous, sputtering gas fitting behind a heavy commercial stove, a delicate, high-risk configuration that 2 standard commercial contractors had flatly refused to touch on short notice. Ray handed me the address and the work order without checking the street name too closely, but the very instant my eyes scanned the bold, raised lettering at the top of the paper, my breath caught violently in my throat. It was 4471 Elmwood Drive. It was the exact multi-million-dollar luxury estate I had purchased with every single penny of my lifetime savings. The very home from which I had been dragged, insulted, and physically thrown out onto the street like worthless garbage just weeks prior. A cold, steely wave of adrenaline surged through my veins, temporarily numbing the dull, throbbing ache in my arthritic knees. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I packed my heavy leather utility belt, pulled my worn gray canvas work cap low over my eyes, let my thick, unkempt gray stubble grow out for another 2 days, and smeared a streak of dark pipe grease across my jawline to alter my appearance. I climbed into my battered old truck and drove back down Interstate 75 toward Naples, transforming myself into an anonymous, invisible tradesman. When I pulled into the pristine, manicured driveway of the Elmwood Drive property, David's sleek German sedan was thankfully absent, meaning I wouldn't have to face my cowardly son just yet. But Jessica was home. She answered the grand double doors, with her smartphone permanently glued to her ear, her face twisted into an expression of intense, multitasking corporate annoyance. She didn't even bother to glance up or make eye contact with the gray-haired plumber standing on her doorstep in stained work pants. She merely waved her manicured hand impatiently, pointed a sharp finger toward the gourmet kitchen, and barked into her phone. "The emergency plumber is finally here." I told the management agency. It only took 3 frantic calls to get someone halfway competent out to this neighborhood. Without uttering a single word, I ducked my head, pulled my cap down further, walked into the magnificent kitchen I had paid for with 4 decades of sweat, and slid my heavy steel toolbox onto the polished tile floor. Jessica treated me with the absolute casual cruelty reserved for common domestic labor. As I knelt down on the hard floor to inspect the warped, water-damaged cabinet base beneath the sink, she strutted past me twice, completely ignoring my physical presence while loudly discussing upscale weekend polo matches and private country club catering options. At one point, she casually dropped an empty glass sparkling water bottle onto the tile just inches from my steel-toed boots, snapping frostily. "Clean that up if it's in your way, and make sure you don't track any of your filthy outdoor grease onto my custom Italian designer rugs." I kept my jaw clamped shut so tight my back teeth ached, swallowing the burning humiliation rising in my throat. I was an invisible ghost in my own house, subjected to the casual, dehumanizing tyranny of a woman who believed her unearned wealth made her entirely untouchable. Working systematically, I began replacing the faulty compression sleeve and reseating the fragile gas line behind the stove, moving with the meticulous, unhurried precision of a seasoned professional. As I reached deep into the shadowed, far corner of the lower wooden cabinet to check the primary water supply shutoff valve, my right forearm brushed sharply against the interior wooden paneling. Something unusual snagged the rough canvas fabric of my work jacket. Frowning, I pulled a heavy brass flashlight from my belt and angled the beam directly into the dark recess of the cabinet. My breath hitched, and my heart violently slammed against my ribs like a sledgehammer. Taped securely to the inside panel of the lower kitchen cabinet, completely hidden from casual view yet preserved carefully beneath a strip of yellowed, aging masking tape, was a faded family photograph. I reached out with a trembling, calloused finger and gently touched the smooth paper edge. It was a snapshot of us from a lifetime ago. Margaret smiling brightly into the summer sun, a little 7-year-old David grinning with a gap-toothed laugh, and a much younger, Thinner version of myself standing proudly with my arm wrapped securely around both of them outside our modest old home in Springfield, staring at that hidden photograph in the dim light of the cabinet. A suffocating mixture of profound sorrow and burning clarity flooded my chest. David hadn't thrown it away. He had brought this solitary memento all the way down to Florida, furnishing his opulent life with expensive catalog items, yet he had secretly taped the sole remaining proof of his true origins inside a dark kitchen cabinet where no casual visitor, and certainly never Jessica, would ever lay eyes on it. It was a silent, pathetic confession. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that beneath all the layers of corporate greed, snobbery, and moral cowardice, my son still remembered who he was and where he came from. He still held a fragile, hidden ember of love for the father who had raised him. But he had willingly extinguished it, selling out his own soul and erasing his heritage for the shallow illusion of wealth and the suffocating comfort of his grasping wife's family. A lesser man might have pulled that photograph down, confronted his daughter-in-law on the spot, or unleashed a storm of righteous anger. But 40 years of engineering taught me that acting on raw emotion only ruins the structural integrity of a plan. This was a slow burn, a quiet gathering of undeniable evidence. I deliberately left the photograph taped exactly where it was, gently closing the dark cabinet door to seal the secret back inside. I stood up on my aching legs, clutching my wrench tightly in my fist as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. I finished tightening the pipe fittings, packed my tools into my canvas bag, and looked at Jessica one last time as she stood by the marble island scrolling through her tablet. "Work is complete," I said, keeping my voice flat, low, and completely unrecognizable. She didn't look up, merely transferring the service fee to Ray's commercial account and waving a dismissive hand. About time. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and climbed back into my truck, carrying a secret that signaled the storm was rapidly approaching. The grueling 2-hour drive back along Interstate 75 from Naples to Tampa felt heavier than the morning trip down, as if every mile of warm Florida asphalt was actively pressing down on the raw, open wounds my son and his wife had inflicted upon my soul. By the time I pulled my battered truck into the sun-faded parking lot of my apartment complex, my knees were throbbing with a relentless stabbing pain, and my spirit was clouded by a profound, suffocating weariness. I dragged my heavy toolbox up the outdoor metal staircase, unlocked the door to room 4B, and set my gear on the floor, letting the quiet, unpretentious familiarity of the small room wrap around me like an old, worn-out blanket. I had spent 40 years crawling through flooded, freezing basements, yet nothing I had ever endured physically could compare to the chilling hollowness of standing in a multi-million-dollar estate only to be treated like an invisible ghost and human debris by my own flesh and blood. Needing an escape from the crushing weight of my own thoughts, I forced my aching legs back down the stairs and walked down the block to the narrow, tightly packed little corner store run by Ray Dominguez. The bell above the door chimed with a cheerful, hollow ring as I pushed my way inside, heading straight for the small beverage cooler in search of a cold bottle of water to wash away the bitter taste of pipe grease and humiliation. When I placed the water bottle and a small box of crackers on the wooden counter, Ray squinted over his wire-rimmed reading glasses, took my cash, and immediately frowned as he fumbled through his register drawer. "I am coming up short on my single-dollar bills tonight, Thomas," Ray muttered with an apologetic chuckle, scratching his graying hair. "I don't have enough small change to give you your exact $3 back. Tell you what, let me slide a quick-pick Powerball lottery ticket into your hand to even out the dollar amount. The jackpot has rolled over for 11 straight weeks and is sitting at an astronomical number right now. Who knows, maybe your luck is about to change." I looked down at the small, crisp slip of paper he slid across the counter toward me. In my 68 years of hard-working life, I had never purchased a single lottery ticket, always viewing them as a foolish tax on people who refuse to accept the honest reality of a hard day's labor. But looking into Ray's kind, weathered eyes, I didn't have the heart to refuse his generous gesture. "Sure, Ray, why not?" I murmured with a faint, tired smile, taking the slip and sliding it securely into the front pocket of my worn canvas work shirt. That evening, sitting alone at the small wooden desk in my room under the dim, buzzing glow of a single lamp, I pulled the Powerball slip out and stared at it for a long, quiet moment. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a stubby wooden carpenter's pencil and slowly, deliberately filled in the 5 numbers using the milestone dates of my life. Margaret's birthday, our wedding anniversary date, and David's birth date. I did not do it out of any desperate, delusional hope of winning a fortune, but simply as a quiet, private ritual of remembrance for a life that had slipped through my fingers. I tossed the ticket onto the corner of the desk, completely dismissing it from my mind, knowing full well that hard work and heartbreak were the only constants I could ever truly count on, just as a heavy wave of isolation threatened to drag me back down into the dark abyss of self-pity. A gentle, Familiar knock rapped against my door. I opened it to find Maria Reyes standing in the dim hallway, holding a steaming, heavy ceramic pot with both hands, her face creased with that deep, empathetic warmth that always managed to anchor me back to reality. "Sit down at that table right now, Thomas," Maria commanded warmly, her voice filled with an unyielding maternal authority. "I made a massive batch of chicken pozole, and my daughter always tells me my biggest character flaw is that I cook enough food to feed an entire battalion. You look like a ghost who hasn't seen a proper meal in 3 days, so you are going to help me solve my problem." We sat at my tiny kitchen table for over an hour, sharing bowls of rich, red broth soup laden with shredded meat, hominy, and fresh lime. Maria didn't pry or push me to talk about my disastrous trip to Naples. Instead, she talked easily and naturally about the vibrant life of the neighborhood, about the local tamale vendor who set up his cart every Friday evening, about the family on the second floor who kept a surprisingly loud rooster, and about her own daughter who called her every single Sunday from Phoenix. Sitting there across from her in that 12 by 15-foot room, listening to the hum of the miniature refrigerator and feeling the nourishing heat of the soup settle deep into my chest, I experienced a rare, profound sense of peace. It was a quiet, unassuming warmth rooted entirely in the genuine kindness of the working class, standing in stark, beautiful contrast to the sterile, heartless luxury of the multi-million-dollar mansion, where my own son had treated me like a discarded piece of trash. Yet, while I was finding a fragile sanctuary in the humble streets of Tampa, a digital firestorm was quietly igniting across the internet, completely unbeknownst to me. Unknown to anyone in our quiet corner of the city, a middle-aged woman living right next door to David and Jessica in that exclusive gated community in Naples had been standing at her second-floor bedroom window on the exact morning of my brutal eviction. Holding her smartphone up with a mixture of shock and utter disbelief, that neighbor had covertly filmed the entire harrowing scene, capturing every agonizing 45 seconds of Jessica shoving my worn leather suitcase across the pristine marble threshold, watching it tip sideways and tumbling violently down the front steps onto the concrete below, while I stood there with trembling hands trying to zip my spilled toiletry bag back together. That very afternoon, the neighbor had uploaded the raw, unedited video footage to a popular local community page with a scathing caption calling out the heartless mistreatment of an elderly father by his wealthy, entitled children. Within 48 hours, the digital algorithm had weaponized the footage, catapulting the video across multiple mainstream platforms including Reddit, X, and Facebook, where it rapidly went viral with millions of views and shares. The title, "Cruelty in Naples, Wealthy Couple Throws Elderly Father Out Like Garbage," ignited a fierce, uncontrollable firestorm. A regional news outlet in Florida picked up the story, broadcasting the heartbreaking clip under a searing headline investigating the ruthless callousness of privileged suburban families abandoning their aging parents. If you feel disgusted by what David and Jessica did to an old man who sacrificed everything, comment the word "deed" right now down below to keep following this story. Across the nation, an overwhelming wave of public fury began to swell. Thousands of outraged internet sleuths and local commentators flooded social media threads with bitter condemnation, aggressively trying to track down and identify the cruel couple featured in the video, digging up public property records and corporate listings tied to the Elmwood Drive address. An underground network of righteous indignation was rapidly organizing, digging deep into the lives of David and Jessica, completely unaware that the broken, gray-haired old man who had walked away from those steps with his head held high was currently sitting in a tiny, sun-faded room in Tampa, quietly eating a bowl of soup, totally oblivious to the fact that a massive, unstoppable storm of public accountability was brewing just over the horizon, waiting to tear their pampered world apart. The morning sun cut sharply through the small, unwashed window of room 4B, casting a pale, dusty beam across the lumpy blue bedspread where I sat in quiet isolation. The air inside the cramped space carried the faint, familiar scent of old wood and the distant hum of traffic pulsing up from the bustling streets of Tampa. It was a Thursday morning that felt entirely indistinguishable from the dozen quiet mornings that had preceded it. A solemn rhythm defined by aching knees, the quiet memory of Margaret's gentle smile, and the honest, calloused hands that still knew how to fix the broken machinery of the world. I had just finished brewing a cup of instant coffee, using the small hot plate on my wooden desk, when my old smartphone buzzed against the surface, vibrating with a sharp, insistent chatter that broke the morning silence. I glanced down at the screen, expecting another automated notification or perhaps a friendly text message from Maria checking in about breakfast. Instead, it was an alert notification from a national news application I had downloaded weeks earlier, flashing a breaking financial update about the massive multi-state lottery jackpot that had dominated the airwaves. Acting on a sudden, unexplainable impulse, a quiet voice whispering in the back of my mind, I unlocked the phone, navigated to the official Florida lottery results page, and pulled the crumpled slip of paper Ray Dominguez had slid across his grocery counter out of my work shirt pocket. My eyes moved slowly, deliberately matching the numbers printed on the screen one by one with the handwritten milestone dates I had scrawled down in pen days ago. Margaret's birthday, the year I first picked up my father's heavy pipe wrench. David's birth date. The screen refreshed, highlighting every single digit in a brilliant, glowing green frame. I stopped breathing entirely. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer, sending a sudden, rushing wave of heat straight to my throat. I stared at the numbers, blinked hard, wiped my glasses, and read them again. Then a third time. The jackpot that had rolled over for 11 consecutive weeks had finally found a single winning ticket sold right here in Florida. $1 billion. The lump sum cash option after federal and state taxes would clear out at just over $600 million, a number so astronomical, so completely detached from the reality of a working-class plumber who had spent 40 years crawling through freezing basements, that it had no physical shape I could possibly hold in my mind. The tiny room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis, the humming miniature refrigerator sounding like a distant waterfall. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, pressing both palms flat against my knees to stop them from trembling violently, struggling to process a reality that had just upended the entire universe in a matter of seconds. Before I could even begin to process the crushing weight of that $600 million reality, my phone buzzed aggressively in my hand once more. This time, it wasn't a lottery notification. The caller ID displayed an incoming call from a Florida area code, tagged with the name of Linda Holt, a premier real estate and property litigation attorney based in Florida. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, my voice coming out rough and breathless. "Mr. Thomas Miller?" A sharp, highly professional yet urgently concerned female voice cut through the line. "My name is Linda Holt. I've been trying to track you down through public records and local contacts for nearly 24 hours. We need to speak immediately regarding the residential property on Elmwood Drive in Naples, Florida. Something illegal, calculated, and deeply damaging is happening with that estate right under your nose, and you need to know about it right now." The mention of the Elmwood Drive house, the very home I had purchased with every single penny of my life savings, only to be physically thrown off its front steps like garbage by my ungrateful son, snapped my racing mind back to sharp, razor-sharp focus. I pushed the lottery numbers to the back of my consciousness, pulled myself upright, and told her to meet me as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, sitting across a polished glass conference table in Linda Holt's office overlooking the city, the full, horrifying scope of my son's moral and legal corruption was laid bare before my eyes. Linda slid a thick, white-tabbed legal folder across the wooden surface, adjusting her reading glasses as she opened the first set of certified documents. "Mr. Miller, let's establish the foundational facts first," Linda began, her tone clipping, precise and laced with suppressed indignation. "Your name is the sole legal name listed on the original grant deed for the Elmwood Drive property, recorded with the county clerk 5 years ago when the purchase was executed. You funded the acquisition entirely, and you carry the legal liability. That makes you the undisputed, sole legal owner of record." "I know that," I replied quietly, my jaw tightening. "I bought it for my son so he would always have a secure roof over his head. Your son apparently believed he could erase that little detail through bureaucratic fraud," Linda countered sharply, sliding a second set of documents across the table. 3 weeks ago, right around the exact time your medical retirement was finalized, David and his wife Jessica filed a preliminary change of ownership report, commonly known as a P-Corp, with the Collier County Assessor's Office. On this official government document, they formally claimed that you had voluntarily transferred full unencumbered real property ownership directly to them. A cold, razor-thin shiver raced down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. "I never signed any transfer deed," I said, my voice dropping an octave into a low, dangerous rumble. "I never authorized a change of ownership, and I certainly never visited a notary public." "That is precisely the smoking gun," Linda stated, tapping her pen against the fraudulent filing. "To legally transfer real estate title in this state, Florida law mandates an executed, notarized grant deed signed directly by the property owner in front of a licensed official. They filed the P-Corp to trigger the tax assessor's database update, but they omitted the notarized deed because they knew you would never sign it away. But it gets much worse, Mr. Miller. My preliminary title investigation into local county filings revealed something far more sinister than a simple family dispute over housing." Linda leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine with grave, professional intensity. This wasn't just a clumsy oversight or an impatient misunderstanding by young people eager to play house. Based on my review of the timeline and supplementary property listings, David and Jessica have been actively coordinating with a high-end commercial real estate broker in Naples to list the Elmwood Drive property for an immediate below-market cash sale. They were systematically conspiring to execute a fraudulent title transfer, sell the multi-million-dollar house out from under you, and completely liquidate your entire lifetime investment into liquid cash. They were deliberately planning to pocket the multi-million-dollar proceeds, divide the cash spoils with Jessica's wealthy real estate mogul parents, and permanently disappear before you ever recovered from your knee surgeries or realized what they had done. The suffocating silence of the law office pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. The bitter, toxic reality washed over me in blinding clarity. David wasn't just emotionally bankrupt. He was a criminal in the making, guided by the greedy, predatory instincts of his wife's family, willing to commit calculated financial sabotage and felony fraud against his own aging father just to pad his luxury lifestyle. Filing a false ownership claim and submitting fraudulent instruments to a government office to alter real estate records is not a civil infraction, Mr. Miller, Linda concluded grimly, watching my face for a reaction. Under Florida Statute Section 817.535, filing a false instrument is a serious felony. It carries mandatory state prison time. They didn't just break your heart, Thomas. They walked straight across a legal line that could land both of them behind iron bars. Sitting there in that quiet law office, holding the paperwork that proved my son had plotted to steal my life savings and throw me into the streets forever, the $600 million Powerball ticket resting in my shirt pocket suddenly felt less like a stroke of blind luck and more like a divine instrument of absolute, unbending justice. The trap fully set, the web of lies was fully exposed, and my son was about to learn that when you try to bury a working-class man who spent 40 years mastering the hidden depths of broken systems, you better make sure the ground you bury him in is deep enough to hold a titan. The warm, golden afternoon sun bathed the sprawling, immaculate back patio of the Elmwood Drive estate in Naples, Florida, in a rich, luxurious glow casting long, lazy shadows across the manicured St. Augustine lawns and the sparkling turquoise surface of the custom infinity pool. It was a picturesque Saturday designed explicitly for the kind of effortless, high-society leisure that defined the upper echelons of local real estate royalty. David and Jessica were hosting an exclusive outdoor celebration. A lavish weekend barbecue ostensibly thrown to toast their glittering social standing, but beneath the superficial veneer of clinking crystal champagne flutes and forced laughter, it was a thinly veiled victory party. They were celebrating the final, successful execution of what they smugly considered to be the masterstroke of their domestic life, permanently ridding themselves of the annoying encumbrance of a broken, impoverished aging father whose working-class existence had long been viewed as an embarrassing stain on their pristine corporate image. While preparing to pocket millions from the covert sale of the property, the guest list was small, intimate, and fiercely selective, consisting entirely of Jessica's wealthy parents, Gerald and Diane Calloway, alongside a couple of elite commercial associates who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about multi-million-dollar land developments and offshore tax shelters. Gerald Calloway lounged comfortably in a designer teakwood patio chair, wearing a crisp linen shirt and holding a tumbler of aged scotch, looking every bit the ruthless real estate mogul who took immense pride in crushing smaller competitors. Diane sat beside him, adorned in expensive diamond tennis bracelets, delicately picking at a gourmet appetizer while discussing the sophisticated nuances of private country club memberships. David stood near the outdoor stainless steel kitchen island, flipping thick cuts of prime ribeye steak on the charcoal grill, a cocktail in one hand and a relaxed, relieved smile plastered across his face. The lingering guilt that had briefly shadowed his eyes the day I was thrown off the porch had long since evaporated, burned away by the soothing balm of absolute financial security and his wife's constant, reassuring validation that they had simply done what was necessary for the family's future. Jessica floated through the gathering with the practiced grace of a socialite who believed the world revolved exclusively around her whims. She wore a stunning white designer sundress, her manicured fingers wrapped securely around a crystal glass filled to the brim with expensive Chardonnay. She paused near the edge of the sprawling stone patio, where a sleek flat-screen outdoor television was mounted beneath the shaded white pergola, broadcasting a live, mid-afternoon regional news and entertainment program for ambient background noise. As the sizzling sound of steaks on the grill mingled with the soft ambient jazz music playing from the patio speakers, Jessica caught sight of a trending viral segment flashing across the lower news ticker of the screen, prompting her to let out a sharp, amused laugh that instantly drew the attention of her parents and husband. "Darling, you have to look at this. It's absolutely priceless," Jessica called out, her voice dripping with sharp, malicious mockery as she pointed a manicured finger directly at the television monitor. They're still replaying that ridiculous viral video on the local news feeds. The one where that dramatic neighbor covertly filmed us tossing the old man's cheap, battered suitcase out onto the front steps a few weeks ago. Gerald Calloway chuckled darkly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass without looking up from his lawn chair. People on the internet love manufacturing fake outrage over nothing, Jess. They don't understand the brutal realities of high-end property management. A man who spends 40 years crawling through filthy sewage ditches has no business expecting a luxury retirement inside a gated community. Exactly, Daddy, Jessica chimed in, taking a slow, triumphant sip of her Chardonnay, her eyes glittering with unbridled malice as she watched a frozen still frame of my bent, gray-haired figure holding a battered zipper bag flash briefly across the screen. Look at the old plumber standing out there on the curb, looking completely pathetic and ragged in our neighborhood. The poor, delusional old fool is probably roaming the gritty streets of some dirty industrial town right now, freezing, begging for loose change, and digging through dumpsters in some slum just to afford a cheap cup of gas station coffee. Good riddance, I say. Trash belongs in the trash can, not in a paradise like Elmwood Drive. Some people are simply born to be common laborers, and no amount of family charity can ever polish a piece of cheap scrap metal into gold. Gerald raised his tumbler high, his booming voice carrying across the manicured yard with sickening satisfaction. Trash belongs right where it lands, he roared, clinking his glass against Diane's, to shedding dead weight, cashing out, and securing our rightful place at the top. Cheers to absolute freedom. David paused his work at the grill for a fraction of a second, a fleeting shadow crossing his features at the sound of his wife and in-laws mocking his father so viciously. But Gerald let out an approving, barking laugh, and Diane nodded in cold agreement, murmuring something about maintaining strict neighborhood standards. Eager to earn the total, unconditional approval of his wealthy in-laws and secure his cut of the fraudulent real estate deal, David quickly swallowed his momentary hesitation, forced a weak, complicit smile back onto his face, and turned his attention back to flipping the steaks, silently burying whatever lingering shreds of filial conscience he had managed to retain. Well, let's drink a toast to that, David added, raising his own cocktail glass toward the sky with a forced, reckless grin, to a clean slate and a bright, lucrative future. As the four adults clicked their glasses together in a joyful, self-congratulatory salute to their own unmitigated cruelty, completely lost in the intoxicating fumes of their arrogance. None of them noticed that the outdoor television broadcast had abruptly cut away from its scheduled lifestyle segment. The studio anchor's voice suddenly shifted from casual banter to a tone of electric, high-stakes excitement, announcing that the historic multi-state Powerball lottery drawings had officially concluded, and the verified single-ticket winner of the staggering, record-breaking $1 billion jackpot was about to step out onto the live national television stage in Los Angeles to claim the historic check, right at that exact, precise microsecond, just as Jessica raised her wine glass to take another triumphant sip of Chardonnay. The camera angle on the patio television instantly shifted from the regional newsroom straight to the brightly lit, star-studded television broadcast stage in Los Angeles. The towering graphic on the screen exploded in brilliant, flashing gold letters. $1 billion winner verify. The studio audience erupted into a deafening roar of applause, and the camera steadily panned across the stage, directly zooming in on the tall, dignified figure of a 68-year-old man standing tall and proud in a freshly tailored navy blue suit, his shoulders squared and his calloused hands resting calmly at his sides. The smug, venomous laughter on the Naples patio died instantly, swallowed whole by a sudden, terrifying silence. The television studio was an electric, high-voltage arena of blinding stage lights and breathless anticipation, the kind of atmosphere that hums with the collective pulse of millions of viewers watching across the nation. I stood in the wings, draped in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, the first piece of high-end clothing I had ever owned in my 68 years. As the floor manager counted down from 10, a profound, crystal-clear serenity washed over me. I wasn't the broken, shivering old man standing on a cold Florida curb anymore. I was a master plumber who had survived 4 decades of freezing basements and heartbreak, standing tall to reclaim the dignity that was rightfully his. When the bright red on-air light flickered to life and the studio audience erupted into a deafening, thunderous ovation, I walked onto center stage with a steady, unhurried stride. The towering screen behind me exploded in brilliant, flashing gold letters. $1 billion winner verify. The lottery official, wearing a crisp uniform and an expression of genuine awe, lifted the ceremonial, oversized check that spanned the width of the stage. The bold black ink clearly displayed a number with 9 zeros, and beneath it, in elegant, unwavering typeface, was the name Thomas Miller. I shook the official's hand, took the check, and turned to face the primary broadcast camera, my expression calm and composed, a quiet anchor in the storm of flashbulbs. I didn't smile like a man who had won a game of blind chance. I stood like a man who had finally seen the scales of justice balance after a lifetime of hard labor. 4 miles away, back at the Elmwood Drive estate in Naples, the atmosphere of the arrogant Victory barbecue had curdled into something wretched and suffocating. The sunny afternoon air, once filled with the clinking of expensive crystal and the smug laughter of people who believed they were untouchable, was now frozen in a state of absolute paralyzed terror. Jessica's raised Chardonnay glass slipped from her numb, locking fingers, shattering against the marble stone patio and splashing wine across her designer sandals, but she didn't even flinch. Gerald Calloway sat utterly motionless, his tumbler of aged scotch slipping from his hand and crashing onto the teakwood deck, his eyes locked onto the monitor with the hollow, haunting gaze of a man watching his entire empire collapse in real time. Diane, the woman who had only hours ago sneered at my calloused hands, was clutching her own throat, her face drained of all color, her diamond bracelets catching the sunlight as her body trembled uncontrollably. David, my son, was the most pathetic sight of all. He had dropped his metal grilling spatula, and it lay forgotten on the concrete, a smear of grease staining his expensive linen shirt. He stared at the screen as if his very reality had been torn asunder, his mouth slightly ajar, his face drained of every drop of blood, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He couldn't process the visual information, the suit, the poise, the sheer, undeniable reality of his father standing there as a global titan of wealth. He had spent his entire life learning how to exploit people, how to project power, and how to discard those he deemed useless, yet here was the man he had thrown into the gutter, now completely untouchable and standing on the summit of the world. If you have been waiting for justice to finally be served to those who betray their own blood, comment the word justice right now down below before we watch the ultimate confrontation unfold. Then, the primal instinct of pure, desperate self-preservation took hold of David. His trembling hand darted into his pocket, his fingers fumbling in a frantic, uncoordinated rush until he pulled out his smartphone. He didn't think about his wife, his in-laws, or the camera lenses. He only thought about the money, the house, and the terrifying realization that his pampered life was slipping into the abyss. He pressed my speed dial button with a shaking, sweaty thumb, staring at the TV screen as if he could force a connection through the glass. Back on the broadcast stage, the massive screens surrounding the set were displaying a live feed of the national response. My personal phone, resting securely in the breast pocket of my navy blue suit, began to vibrate with a persistent, frantic ring. I glanced down at the caller ID, David. The studio audience suddenly quieted, a murmur of curiosity rippling through the rows of people as they noticed the distraction. The primary camera zoomed in tight on my face, picking up the call notification. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn away or hit decline. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the phone, and with a slow, deliberate motion that the entire world watched in breathless anticipation, I pressed answer, activated the speakerphone, and brought the device directly up to the broadcast microphone pinned to my suit lapel. "Dad?" David's voice crackled through the stage monitors and out into millions of living rooms across the country, sounding high-pitched, cracked, and utterly broken. "Dad, I just saw you on TV. I saw you on the news. I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry, Dad. Please, you have to come home right now. We'll take care of you, I swear. Everything will be different. Just please, talk to us." I didn't let him finish his scripted, hollow apologies. I stood perfectly still, looking straight into the camera lens, my voice steady, resonant, and cold enough to shatter glass. "David," I said, my words carrying into every corner of the nation, "I'm looking at the screen right now. I see the yard, I see the patio, and I see the people you're hiding behind. Tell me, the house in Naples you're currently standing in, the one you tried to steal from me, have you paid this month's rent yet? Or are you calling because you've already figured out that you can't afford it without the father you threw out like trash?" The silence that followed across the airwaves was heavy, absolute, and agonizing. On the Naples patio, David made a choking sound, a desperate, gargantuan gulp of air, but no coherent words came out of his throat. I didn't wait for him to find his footing or craft another lie. "Don't bother calling again, David. You don't have a father anymore. You only have a landlord who's about to evict you." I tapped the end call button with a precise final click. I didn't look at the camera with rage or malice. I looked at it with the calm, terrifying indifference of a man who had paid his dues and collected his change. Tucking the phone back into my pocket, I straightened my navy blue jacket, turned to the lottery official, and accepted the official plaque. The entire world was watching, but for the first time in 40 years I felt completely, unshakably free. I had survived the freezing basements, the cancer wards, and the ultimate betrayal of my own flesh and blood. Now it was their turn to freeze. The golden Sunday morning in Naples, Florida, arrived with a deceptive, tranquil beauty that stood in stark, brutal contrast to the total wreckage currently unfolding inside the Elmwood Drive estate. At exactly 8:43 a.m., I arrived at the Grand Iron front gate, accompanied by my legal counsel, Linda Holt, and two uniformed deputies from the Collier County Sheriff's Office. Linda walked with a steady clinical precision, carrying a thick leather portfolio that contained not just legal papers, but the official, undeniable death warrant for my son's stolen lifestyle. As we approached the massive double oak doors, I felt no surge of childish triumph, no adrenaline-fueled joy, only a profound, hollow sense of finality. This was the house I had spent 40 years of freezing, back-breaking labor to secure. It was the house I had bought with my own life's blood, and today I was here to reclaim my dignity under the full authority of the law. David opened the door, and for a fleeting, sickening moment, he looked like the helpless boy I had raised alone, the gap-toothed child who used to hide behind my legs when he was scared of thunder. Now he was a hollowed-out shell of a man, unshaven and trembling violently, his face a ghostly, bloodless mask of someone who hadn't slept a single second since he saw his father standing on the national television stage claiming a billion-dollar prize. When he looked up and saw me standing next to the county deputies, the last remaining color drained from his skin so violently that he nearly collapsed against the entryway wall. "Dad," he croaked, his voice cracking like dry, brittle kindling. "Please, just listen to me. I can explain everything. I was weak, I was wrong, please." "Dad?" I didn't let him finish his script of hollow apologies. I simply stepped past him into the marble foyer, my heavy, steel-toed work boots echoing against the polished stone like a gavel strike. Inside, the living room was a scene of absolute, uncompromising ruin. Gerald and Diane Calloway, once so impossibly arrogant and poised, looked like scavengers caught red-handed in a trap. Gerald stood near the fireplace, his chest deflated, his signature real estate swagger utterly vanquished. He was merely a broken old man who had bet his daughter's future on a fraudulent, predatory scheme. Jessica hovered near the hallway entrance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face stripped of every layer of practiced composure she had spent years constructing. Linda Holt didn't waste a single syllable. She placed her leather folder on the coffee table and opened it with the surgical efficiency of an executioner. "Grant deed," Linda stated, her voice sharp, unrelenting, and reverberating through the silent house. "Recorded with Collier County records 5 years ago. Thomas Miller, sole legal owner. Lease agreement, David Miller, tenant. And here," she added, sliding the final certified document onto the pile, "is the fraudulent report your son and his wife filed claiming a voluntary transfer of ownership without a notarized deed. Filing a false instrument with a government office is a serious felony under Florida Statute Section 817.535, Mr. Calloway. We have the forensic proof, we have the clear intent, and we are serving a formal 3-day eviction notice alongside notice of pending criminal charges." Gerald's face turned a mottled, sickly shade of gray as he sank heavily into the sofa, unable to look the deputies in the eye. David, meanwhile, dropped straight to his knees on the cold tile floor, pressing his face into his palms, his shoulders racking with heavy, uncontrollable, gasping sobs. It wasn't the sound of a man mourning the tragic loss of his father's love. It was the raw, jagged sound of a pampered child mourning his own unearned luxury. I looked down at him, this boy I had carried alone through 30 brutal New England winters, and felt a cold river-like grief wash through my chest. I didn't reach for him. I didn't offer a hand to lift him up. When I had been thrown off this very porch weeks ago, there was no hand reaching down for me. "David," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of mercy. "What did you do? You sold your own blood for a house you didn't pay a dime for and a name that wasn't yours. You thought that because I was a plumber, I was something you could just discard and replace." He had no answer. He only sobbed harder, a completely broken man who had finally run out of lies. Outside, the quiet gated neighborhood began to stir. A massive, industrial moving truck idled at the curb, its diesel engine rumbling like a warning bell. Jessica walked out to the porch, clutching a mountain of designer luggage and luxury shopping bags, her eyes red, swollen, and smeared with mascara. I watched through the front window as she moved down the stone path, her movements sluggish and weighted, as if she were carrying the physical mass of her own crushed hubris. Neighbors peered through their curtains and stood on their lawns, whispering and pointing as they saw the self-proclaimed real estate royalty reduced to common migrants being escorted out under the watchful eyes of law enforcement. Gerald and Diane Calloway slunk out behind her, completely powerless, humiliated, and forced to carry their own bags in utter disgrace. It was a sight of total, uncompromising collapse. As the deputies finalized the walkthrough, I walked into the kitchen and opened the lower cabinet beneath the sink. Reaching deep into the dark corner, I peeled away the strip of yellowed masking tape and retrieved the faded family photograph. I walked back to the foyer where David still sat on the floor, holding his eviction envelope with trembling, white fingers. "Take the picture from the cabinet," I said, my voice cutting through his quiet weeping as I placed the photograph into his shaking hands. "Keep it. It's the only honest thing you have left." He didn't look up, only gripped the paper as the deputies ushered him past the threshold. I walked out of the house one last time, leaving the front door wide open to let the fresh air sweep away the lingering decay of greed. I didn't look back at the grand foyer or the marble floors. I had already decided what this place would become. Months later, the Elmwood Drive estate had undergone a total, magnificent metamorphosis. The tall, secretive hedges that once hid the house were gone, replaced by a welcoming open garden. The wrought iron sign above the main gate no longer spoke of luxury, gated exclusivity, or country club status. In bold, clean lettering it read, "The Miller Vocational Center. No trade is beneath dignity. Only ingratitude makes a person small." I refused to sell the house for a profit. Instead, I transformed the fortress of greed into a fountain of genuine opportunity, where young trade apprentices, the kind of hardworking kids I used to be, could learn carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work with their own hands, building a future and finding the self-respect that David had so carelessly squandered. I stood in my new office, the room where David once kept his private home gym, and set my old steel toolbox near the door. On my desk, I placed a replica of that old family photograph, framed cleanly in oak beside a brass plaque engraved with the core philosophy of my life. I had learned through fire that family justice doesn't come from a loud shout, a fistfight, or wallowing in anger. It comes from the quiet, immovable refusal to let anyone define your worth. I had been an old man who lost everything, only to discover that the fire was never in the house or the money. It was in the unbreakable iron of my own character. The greatest revenge is not knocking your enemies down with rage, but standing so high on the summit of human dignity that you turn your deepest bitterness into a lighthouse for those who truly deserve the light. Honor and dignity are things no one can ever steal from you unless you hand them over yourself. I chose to hold on to mine. Stand tall, keep your spirit unbreakable, and always remember, you are the sole author of your own redemption. True family justice never needs a shouting crowd. It only needs a heart that refuses to go cold.